Hi, Penny. Thank you for joining us today. Now, I understand, just from our brief interaction, that you have a very lengthy history working in the Salesforce ecosystem, and so I anticipate that listeners, of this particular video, but also potentially of perhaps of our conversation on a podcast, are going to be really interested to hear to learn from perhaps your journey through the Salesforce ecosystem, but also, specifically, we're here today to talk about, recruiting and your experience working, with Lee and Teresa and the team at Resource on Demand. So before we get into that part of the conversation, though, perhaps, for everybody who is listening and watching, maybe you could just share, what your journey has been over the last 15 years in the ecosystem. Just to start.
Yeah, sure, Sharon. Really nice to meet you. And I think, like many people, I fell into the Salesforce world by accident.
Right.
So I started doing Salesforce work about 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that at that time, there were mostly two routes that people followed to get into Salesforce. There were people like me who'd been in sales leadership and then kind of got into Salesforce because we were using Salesforce, implementing Salesforce, being the subject matter experts, and then getting more on the technology side.
Yeah.
And then the hard technical guys, a lot of them were coming to Salesforce from other technologies, from Siebel very much at the time, but maybe also from places like Oracle, where they were seeing similarities in the technology, but really exciting new opportunities. So it was an interesting time because it was new. Every person in the space was new, and the technology and the ways of working were all new to all of us. And I think that was nowhere more true than for recruiters as well.
Yes.
So for Lee and Teresa and Rod at the time, they were the first in the UK. They were
They
early
were.
movers.
Yeah. Actually, I think in Europe, believe it or not.
Wow.
Um,
I can.
yeah, I think, and very, I guess, very sort of forward thinking to actually have the confidence and the conviction then to nail their hat to this as a niche, because it was so new at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah. And challenging for them, very different challenges at that time compared to, say,
Mm,
today, because they were, all of these roles were new, and they
yeah,
were having to really focus on people's transferable skills,
yeah,
and
right.
having to give a lot of support both to
Mm,
recruiting managers, but
yes.
also to candidates about
Mm,
what type of role to go for and how to move into those roles. And,
yeah.
that was very important, I think, for kind of setting out career pathways for people.
Mm,
And so, yeah, they were super important kind of in some of my early jobs, but
yeah.
also in helping me identify roles as well as then to go ahead and fill them.
And fill them as well. Yeah. So, I mean, if we just sort of like go back then, in let's say in the early stages of your career, um, what was generally your experience of working with recruitment companies? Had you worked with them prior to working with Resource on Demand?
Yeah, so before working with Rod, I
Mm,
had recruited a lot of other people in the
right.
past,
Mm,
and those had tended to either be salespeople or administrators, and my previous history had been to use local recruitment firms.
right.
So
Yeah.
that personal service that you get from Lee and Teresa, and really knowing their customers and knowing their client base, was always very important to me.
Right.
So I'd always worked with recruiters who, had a good list of candidates that they placed maybe multiple times, where they knew other local businesses,
Mm,
they knew people, and they knew me well enough to know who would be a good fit.
yeah.
And I guess that's because when I'd been very young, I'd temped a lot through
Right.
agencies. So I kind of had a
Right.
good understanding of how to
Yeah.
get the best out of them.
Got you.
And
Yeah.
so my work with Rod was the first time that I'd ever used a subject matter kind of expert group of recruiters rather
Right,
than purely
okay.
local. So that was quite a big
Right.
change for me.
And was that a deliberate thing then? I mean, how did you guys meet, Lee and Teresa?
Yeah, so that was absolutely deliberate for me, and that
Right.
was because Salesforce was so new that
Mm,
if I'd gone to another recruiter, they wouldn't have even known what I was talking about. And if
right,
I'd said
okay.
Salesforce, they would have literally thought I meant like a force of
A
salespeople.
team. Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah.
And so it just couldn't have worked.
No.
And I got introduced to Lee and Teresa by a contractor who was working in Salesforce, who had got a job through them himself. And at that
Right.
time, the Salesforce kind of world in the UK was very, very small. So we
Mm,
were kind of introducing one another to these key people. And
yeah.
I think, back then you'd go to a Salesforce event, the equivalent of the world tour today, where 12,000 people might go to that now, but back then it would be like 30 people. And
Oh
so,
my gosh.
Lee
Wow.
and
So it's almost
Teresa.
like everybody was on first name terms.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right. Okay. Um, and so I guess, in the early days, what was your experience then of working with Lean Tweezers? Because it sounds like there was a definitive decision that, actually I am not going to get the support as a line manager recruiting the kind of people that I want other than through someone who really knows this ecosystem. So, I mean, what was it like? And I guess what made you, other than the fact that there probably weren't many agencies specializing in it at the time, what made you, I guess, continue to go back and keep working with Rod?
I think there are a couple of answers to that.
Mm,
Partly it's their expertise at matching people. So
right.
I could describe what I was looking for, maybe at what stage somebody was in their career. In those early days as well, a key thing that I was looking for was people really being committed to Salesforce as a career and actually understanding it, because
Right.
there was a danger that you'd sometimes see candidates who were maybe bandwagon jumpers who thought, oh, that's going to be a
Yeah.
great place, but didn't really understand what they were going to be getting themselves into.
Okay.
And those might be great on paper candidates, people may be
Mm,
very technically strong, but without the interpersonal skills that you need to do a Salesforce project well. And
yeah.
I could rely on Rod to not send me those candidates.
Right.
They would appreciate what I was looking for, and
Yeah.
they would be able to weed those out for me.
Yeah.
And they understood kind of how I worked, how I built my team, the combination of skills that I was looking for, which meant
Mhm.
both for hiring and for when I was looking for my next role, they were able to do a good fit.
Yeah.
Um, in the early days, there were few recruiters around. Then, as more started to pop up, there was some that were really only interested in very expensive, very senior postings. And then
Mm,
others came up who were much more about high turnover. And,
right.
and they would send you, 50 candidates, and most of those would be people that were just so not ready yet,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so Lee and Teresa were just much more thoughtful about who they would put on their books and what kind of
Yeah.
jobs they'd be putting them forward for.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that certainly, having worked with them, ourselves for quite a number of years now, that, clearly there are people in that tech world who, want to be constantly stretching and looking at the next bright, shiny object in terms of the next great piece of technology. And of course they want to get that on their CVs. But as you say, um, it's not always about hopping to the next bright shiny new thing, isn't it? I think certainly having interviewed clients as well. Some of these projects, they're huge, aren't they? And they can be 12, 18-month projects. And so I can appreciate what you're saying about that blend of technical expertise, but with really strong interpersonal skills as well to lead projects and stuff. Um, and so So thinking then about, perhaps, because this is interesting actually, it's great talking to someone who has worked with Salesforce for so long, but also worked with Lee and Teresa and the team. So how has your, I guess, your relationship and your experience, let's talk as a line manager initially, how has that evolved over time? Because the ecosystem is very different today than what it was when obviously you first joined.
Yeah, I mean, it's radically different now.
Mm,
And right now, it's kind of the candidates market as well. Every company in the space is desperately trying to hire.
mm,
And there are many, many new entrants into the Salesforce space, but fewer and fewer kind of as you go up with experience. It's been a
right.
great space for people to become entrepreneurs themselves in the
Yes.
Salesforce world. So
Yeah.
lots of people have set up as independent consultants or they've built
Mm,
ISV companies, and that's fantastic. But that has definitely impacted on people's ability to grow their own careers. So there is a skills shortage,
right.
and I think other recruiters then are attempting to kind of push people up. So you've got, and you see this on LinkedIn all the time, candidates that maybe only have 18 months experience as a Salesforce
Mhm.
admin going for senior, highly paid roles that they're really not ready for.
Ready for right.
And Lee and Teresa really kind of uh, are leading the charge on, I think, a very different way of recruiting. And so they invest much more time and effort in
Mm,
fitting candidates to roles that might be more junior, might not be as well paid as some of those, but will actually help give them the strength and depth so that rather than just job hop because they keep failing, their people will be successful, grow
yes.
their skills, and be able to have a really solid career.
Yes.
And they can advise candidates about that in a
Mm,
way that I think very few recruitment companies in our space actually can.
yes. And so, I guess as a hiring manager, I imagine that you probably had experience of that, getting that right, and when it hasn't worked, when you've got someone who's not quite ready for the role. But what so if someone was listening to this as someone who's very ambitious, and sometimes a bit impatient to want to really, fast track and progress, um, what could you share with them about perhaps about the impact of when someone goes into role and it is slightly too soon for them, and actually it is better long term for their career to, perhaps to take the guidance and advice of, people like Lee and Teresa.
It is still a relatively small ecosystem,
Mm,
and it is very competitive. So candidates really run the risk of damaging their reputations if they go into the wrong job.
mm,
It's very easy to kind of be super ambitious in the way that you push yourself forward, but
yes.
if you don't actually know the subject matter, then that's going to create problems, and then that will actually hit you when you try to move on to your next role.
No.
And I think while getting some diversity in your career is important, and I'm a great example of that, having worked at GSIs, boutique firms, ISVs, end users, I think that range of experience is important. So you
Mm,
do command the subject matter. I
yeah.
think just rushing to go up levels all the time can be very counterproductive. Um,
Mm,
and can end up stifling your career. And I think that Lee and Teresa, both for candidates and hiring managers, they're true business partners in that
mhm,
they will help you find the candidate who is on a career path and got a trajectory that they can maybe grow into within your organization, but
yeah.
also for candidates to help give them a solid career rather than just jump from job to job because things aren't quite working out, right?
Mm,
And that's very, very valuable, and is why I will often recommend to both candidates and line managers that I know that they talk to Resource on Demand whenever they've
mm,
got a job or something difficult to fill,
yes.
because Lee and Teresa do know the space very well, and they know people and
Mm.
where they fit really, really well.
Yeah. And you've mentioned a few times, Penny, about, perhaps their ability to match and how they will take more time to match. Could I maybe just ask you to speak a bit more about, from your perspective, what that involves?
And I think that's an area that's got more complicated over time as well.
Mm,
So when I started in Salesforce, there was Sales Cloud and a couple
mm,
of hundred apps on the App Exchange. And since then, there are myriad clouds and, 8,000 apps or something like that. It's just hugely, hugely
mm.
different now. Um, and and that is a challenge because nobody can be skilled in everything, and
Yeah.
we all have to experiment with what's coming next. And I
Mm,
think that when it comes to the matching, Lee and Teresa are really good at understanding people. One of the challenges in our Salesforce space is that there's a lot of emphasis put on certifications. So
that's right. Yes.
you sit
Yeah.
the exam, you get the cert. And
Mm,
certs are a useful proxy for things like people's commitment to the ecosystem, for their
mhm.
base knowledge, for the effort they've put in, for some core understanding. But you couldn't just go and pass a couple of certs and then run a project. Like there's a
Mm,
huge gulf between those two things.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
and there are some recruiters out there who just look at a job, will maybe look up what clouds are mentioned in that set of requirements and then match those with who's got the certs and send those through.
Yeah.
That is a poor thing to do in a couple of ways, because firstly, just because somebody's got the cert doesn't mean they can do the job, but
Yeah.
also a lot of people that have worked on the most challenging projects in that space won't have had the time or the inclination to get the certification. And actually, for most hiring managers, seeing somebody that's got 5 real years of experience, maybe hands-on with something like CPQ,
Mm,
but
mhm.
hasn't got around to getting the cert, you're going to take the CV with the experience over the certified person
Right.
every day, right?
Yeah.
And what you need is your partner in the recruitment to help you navigate your way through that,
Mm,
because you don't want to take the uncertified person who isn't really committed to a career in
mm,
Salesforce, but
mm.
equally you don't just want someone that's been able to rack up a bunch of certs but hasn't quite got the
Yeah.
hands-on
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, certainly, I can think of conversations that I've had with Lean Teresa where we've been talking about, sometimes the scale of these projects and perhaps the time investment that, perhaps, a consultant 100% of their time can sometimes actually be on the role. And so, if they're doing 12, 13, 14 hours a day, it's understandable that then it becomes more challenging to then put time in to get the certs, because I don't imagine it's a quick sit down for a few hours and read a book and do an online test, is it? It's
Yeah.
probably a whole lot more rigorous than that. So I think that's a really valuable point to highlight there. Just building on that, I'm just intrigued to know, let's say, just with your line manager's hat on for now, and then perhaps we can come to you as a candidate. Um, when that match works and that's got right, I guess this is from your past experience as well. Um, what impact does that have for you, as a line manager, on the results that you can deliver versus when the match is not quite right? When you've had times when it's not been right, perhaps in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's very circumstantial actually, Sharon. So
Right.
the impact is different whether it's an end user or an ISV or a
Okay.
consultancy, because
Right.
there are different things there. At an
Mm,
end user, I'd say that's where it's kind of most important,
yeah.
because that's where the people around that hire don't know Salesforce and are
Yeah.
depending on that person to
Yes.
kind of be the touchstone on
Got you.
Salesforce.
Got
And if
you.
that is if that person is misplaced in that role because either they don't quite have the knowledge of the product, or they don't really understand the sector they're in, then
Yeah.
that can lead to things like poor adoption, to the Salesforce implementation not quite working for that organization,
Yeah.
and for them as an individual, that could hurt their career, because it might be then that the end user they're in thinks maybe, oh, well, the implementation maybe wasn't great then, but
Yeah.
actually perhaps the consultancy that implemented it did a brilliant job, and it's just your new admin isn't quite running it properly. So that can be almost the toughest one, because it's harder to identify what's gone wrong. But having worked with that, if you have the wrong person in an end user role, it really ripples out in terms of problems. At an ISV, they tend to be smaller businesses. Customer service is more key. If things go wrong, that can lead to churn. Your customer just needs one bad interaction, and they're going to be Googling who your competitors are. And so you really need that person to be protecting your reputation. That's just absolutely vital. And what I've found is that the time from hire to productivity is the biggest gap that you get there with that hiring. You want to have somebody that's confident enough to get going quickly, but isn't running before they can walk and taking tickets and getting things wrong. And so those are kind of some of the impacts there, as well as then culturally, because the culture in an ISV is absolutely core to their success. And I think that's true across the board.
Yeah. And I guess just thinking about some of the points you were saying there, in the market as it is right now, which is sort of very candidate short, I appreciate that companies are going to be wanting to fill those vacancies as quickly as they can, and yet it almost sort of increases the importance of getting that match right, because yes, an agency could pop over very quickly a whole bunch of CVs, but if they're not the right ones and the match is not there, then you're into some of those issues that you've just shared with us. Whereas sometimes actually the importance of getting that match right, it might be that the CVs take an extra day or so to come through, but if you're prepared to just hold it for a longer amount of time, that actually long term it's going to be far more valuable to you. So the importance of the match, it just seems probably even more important now. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And being able to have a recruitment partner that is a true business partner for you.
Yes.
Because if you're in maybe a smaller end user organization, a charity, for example, they are struggling to fill their Salesforce vacancies right now, because they're competing against big consultancies that can pay a lot more money for those same candidates. And so having a business partner like Rod can give them the confidence to kind of widen the net of who they'd consider, because Rod will find them candidates that are maybe somebody whose primary area of knowledge is within their industry and who know Salesforce a bit but are on a journey to learn it. And that might actually be a much, much better candidate for them than somebody that's 20 years old, been in work for 6 months, but has 5 certs, right? And they might see 20 CVs of that kind of person from agency A, and one person who's kind of older and from the sector, but doesn't know Salesforce so well, from Rod. And it's very tempting when you don't feel like you know the subject matter well enough to think, oh, I've got safety in the certs, and if there's so many candidates here, this must be the kind of person I want. But really, that's where they need to trust who Resource on Demand is sending them, because it's probably a much, much better fit.
Yeah, great. Some really gems of advice here. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Maybe if we kind of just turn the table a little bit then, in terms of your experience as a candidate, because as you described and shared with us earlier, that your career has taken into all the different areas, I guess, of different sort of Salesforce partners and users. So when you've been the candidate, when you've been looking for that next, step, how has your relationship, evolved, from a personal perspective in your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot because in my first couple of Salesforce jobs, I didn't really even see myself as having a Salesforce career. If you'd asked me, I'd have said, "God, is that what I do?" It was still a kind of a shock to me. And so it's changed a lot as time's gone on. And actually,
Mm,
over the years, I've really appreciated the advice from Lee and Teresa about where might be a good fit for me, about what kind
right.
of roles there were. Um, yeah, they've been great at talking to me about what might work.
Mm,
And because they know me quite well as well, they've been able to talk to companies that I might go to about me
mm,
and help really identify whether it was going to be a fit before I even met with anybody.
right.
So they've been really great at understanding what motivates me, what I'm good at,
Mm,
what I'm not so good at,
mhm,
and knowing how that fits, um, and with different people in different teams, and
mm,
also helping me with what I might want to do next.
yes. And actually, I was thinking of that in terms of, perhaps, what your experience has been, as you perhaps have been getting to a point where you're ready for the next step. What perhaps has been your experience of conversations where maybe, through chatting with Lee and Teresa, that they've got you to widen your own thinking in terms of, what to consider?
Yeah, they've done that several times actually,
Mm,
where I hadn't considered a particular company or type of role, and they've been able to
mm,
say, "I think what you're describing is a program manager, or I think what you're describing is this or that," and to
right.
do that fit.
Yes.
But probably the best example was when they matched me up for the job at Presido. I'm sure Matt won't mind me saying this, that it was kind of, almost like a matchmaker type situation, and it was
Right.
just a perfect fit. It was
Yeah.
amazing. And so, Matt wasn't openly looking for the role. He hadn't advertised for it. He hadn't gone out to market. But,
Mm,
Lee and Teresa knew that I was looking for another job, and they just felt like the COO role there would be a good fit for me and that I would be a good fit for Presido. And
mm.
literally within 5 minutes of me and Matt meeting each other, like, that was just totally the right
Yeah.
thing to do, and it was
Yeah.
just yeah, I was exactly what he needed at the time, and that was
Mm,
exactly the right job for me at the time. It was,
yeah.
and that was 100% out of
Mm,
Lee and Teresa's minds, that entire
yeah.
fit. That
Yeah.
was not a job I'd articulated that I wanted, and there
Mm,
was no job advertised, and they
yeah.
just figured out that would be great, and
Okay.
they were absolutely right about that.
Yeah. And so when you think about, let's just talk a second then about Lean Teresa. What do you think it is about them and their approach that allows them, I guess, to get that level of understanding that contributes towards being able to make the quality of matches that you've been describing today?
I think partly it's longevity. They really do understand the market very well, and they've seen it kind of go through lots of different phases.
Mm,
Partly, I think it's because of the quality of their own recruitment. So, there are some other firms in the space that have grown incredibly quickly and have
mm,
hundreds of recruitment consultants. Then you end up with a very kind of cutthroat way. They're all competing with each other. They're all only in that job for 5 minutes before they're off to the next place. Whereas Lee and Teresa run their business in a much more personal, steady way. So whether
mm,
you're a hiring manager or a candidate, you will speak to the same person multiple times. It is just a
mm,
team there. And
mm.
that really does make a difference because then their values translate throughout their whole team and how they
Yeah,
do business. And
yeah.
that really helps them even though the company's grown and they're not so hands-on as maybe they were 12
Mhm,
years ago,
mhm.
it means that they still really do understand the market very well.
Yes, yeah. And so I guess, in summary, if there was someone who perhaps was looking for some real career advice. I mean, there is so much opportunity in the Salesforce market right now, isn't there? But if somebody has had some ups and downs perhaps in their career, what would you say that perhaps might lead them towards picking up the phone, dropping an email, and having a conversation with Lee and Teresa? And then perhaps from a line managed perspective, if they're finding it challenging getting the quality of Salesforce expertise that they're looking for, what might you say to that kind of individual, who's doing the kind of role you are?
Yeah, so I think for candidates, especially if things haven't been working, but you don't really know why,
Right.
then a
Yeah.
conversation with Lee or Teresa is a really, really good way to kind of figure out what's going wrong, because they have the experience that you can describe the circumstances and their instincts will be really solid about what happened there. And there's a good chance that whoever is the head of the practice or the head of the department is somebody that they know. So
Right.
they'll be able to know a bit about how that person operates and maybe how things went wrong. And
Yeah.
they'll be able to give you some really good pointers as to what to work on to prevent that for the future.
Great
Um,
advice.
and I think for hiring managers, the biggest challenge is probably being inundated with CVs where it's very difficult to kind of spot the difference between them. And and I think if what you're looking for is more about soft skills and culture fit, then
Mm-hmm.
you can have a conversation with Lee and Teresa about that. And I've been really tough sometimes and said, I don't want to see 10 CVs a week. If you send me them, I'm not even going to open those emails, because there'll be others you just get spammed into oblivion with
Yeah.
CVs, and I just don't even want to see it.
Yeah.
Whereas Lee and Teresa, actually, at times when I've been recruiting, one of the biggest compliments I could pay to them is that every single conversation I had with one of their candidates was worthwhile. Even if they were not the right fit, I could understand why
Mm-hmm.
they put them forward to me. Even
Yes.
if it wasn't going to progress, I could see, okay, they were thinking that this person ticks this box and they'd fit in this way. And
Yes.
and I've said that to them before in the feedback,
Mm.
and generally, at any point in my career, I would have happily interviewed every single person they sent me, because I
Yeah.
do trust the validation that they've done on the candidates before they
Yeah.
send them my way. And
Yeah.
I definitely couldn't say that about every agency.
Yeah.
And I can always see the logic of what they were thinking
Mm.
with each candidate that
Mm.
they put forward.
Yeah.
And I think if you're a hiring manager getting frustrated with seeing
Mm.
all of these CVs and not making sense of them, I think
Yeah.
working with Lee and Teresa on that would really, really help you.
Yeah. And I guess that is the ultimate compliment, isn't it? That, your time is so kind of like, valuable as everybody's is, and the candidates that you speak to as well. But, for you to, feel that every single conversations add value and you get the logic behind why you were asked to speak to that person, then that is, that's fabulous feedback. Thank you for sharing that. Um, Is there anything perhaps that you would like to add that I haven't asked you or hasn't come out in conversation, just as we come to a close?
No, I don't think so, really. I think a big untapped market in our space is
Mm,
for cross-training people that have maybe done consultancy type work, but in a completely different environment, perhaps not even in technology.
right.
I think somebody that's consulted about good business process could have an
Mm,
amazing career in Salesforce. And I think there is an onus on all of us to help create the opportunity for people to
mm,
transition, because
mhm.
relying just on people coming out of university or college to kind of backfill our shortage isn't going to get there. We need people with the
No.
business and consultancy expertise. And
Yes.
I think it's on folks like Lee and Teresa to go and find those people, but also
Mhm.
on all of us as hiring managers to really be open
Oh,
to giving
yes.
those people a shot. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, that would be one thing where I'd love to see more of that happen in the community.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would be
Yeah.
it.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And again, I think some real gems of advice and insights for both candidates and for other line managers like yourself. So thank you very much, Penny. It's been lovely to meet you and to chat to you. And hopefully it won't be the last time.
Thanks, Sharon. Lovely to meet you.
You too as well. Bye for now.